Yesterday, the UK magazine Spectator published a piece by Prime Minister Boris Johnson's sister titled, "It's Hard Not to Pity Ghislaine Maxwell." Rachel Johnson details her encounters with Maxwell while the two attended Oxford. Boris Johnson was once an editor at The Spectator and was included in his sister's account of meeting Maxwell. Rachel describes as a freshman, quote, finding a shiny glamazon with naughty eyes holding court astride a table, a high-heeled boot resting on my brother Boris's thigh. Katie Halper, host of the Katie Halper Show on YouTube and co-host of the Useful Idiots podcast, joins us to discuss. Katie, what do you make of this? I've got my thoughts, but what do you make of this piece that Boris Johnson's sister wrote?
Well, it's funny. It's pretty disgusting, and it's almost like you can't make this stuff up. I feel like anyone like criticizing or critiquing the incestuous relationship among elites in the media, the political world, and I guess the pedophilia world would almost make a joke about this. Like, oh, you know, they sit on each other's laps at Oxford. And it turns out they do actually sit on each other's laps at Oxford. And you have something that any person with any awareness would actually hide. Like the fact that this serial abuser was sitting, had her leg on your brother's thigh, who is prime minister. That's something that anyone with any awareness would hide, not put into writing.
Although, can we acknowledge that this article, do we have the original element from it, contained the greatest subhead in the history of subheads? The subtitle of the article was, "We met briefly at Oxford."
I know, it is. It's hard not to pity Ghislaine Maxwell. We met briefly at Oxford.
Oh, yeah, that was good.
Thank you.
I mean, Katie, is that correct? As a longtime media critic, is that the greatest subhead in the history of subheads?
You know what? Actually, I'm going to push back a little bit because I have one that is a pretty good competition, and that is a Daily Mail headline that reads the following. Pre-trial makeover. Ghislaine Maxwell shows off freshly dyed black roots and new bob haircut and ditches prison jumpsuit for a black turtleneck and slacks at court hearing ahead of sex trafficking trial. So they talk about her glamorous look at a pre-trial hearing in New York on Monday. But I got to give them credit, the Daily Mail, for actually putting sex trafficking in the headline. They do open with the freshly dyed black roots and new bob haircut, but they have the decency to include the fact that this fashion icon was appearing at a sex trafficking trial. A lesser newspaper would leave that out of the headline. They would just focus on the bob.
They do. I can't remember who was making this point on Twitter, but I sort of agreed with it that there's been a lot of coverage that's like, oh, Ghislaine Maxwell is actually worse than Jeffrey Epstein because there needs to be like it's like when you have like in a Marvel movie, you know, you have the sub-villain and then you have the main villain later, and Jeffrey Epstein's premature demise rendered that narratively unsatisfying and impossible. So even if I don't know, we're going to find out, but assuming she was, you know, the lesser, the patsy kind of thing, but the coverage doesn't suggest that because it needs to be, or maybe we'll find out she was even worse than him or something, but I don't know that that's true, but she needs to be because we were robbed our vengeance.
I mean, they're like evil children. I don't have a more hated one of either of the two, I would say.
I think you bring up a really good point about this piece in regards to, you know, they're talking about Oxford, and we met at Oxford, and seeing her, you know, putting her boot on her brother Boris's thigh, who's now prime minister. I think this really shines a light on what we've all known, which is that Ghislaine Maxwell was able to facilitate these meetings for Jeffrey Epstein and these young girls, and, you know, finding power players, kind of somehow wrangling them all up. And this entire list from of powerful people from various countries around the world. And it's just really a showcasing of this. And you're right, she probably should have kept that quiet because now everyone's going to be looking at Boris Johnson like, well, what you know, how involved have you been?
Sorry, I cut you off.
But the one thing that I will say in reading the piece is that I know I'm going to say something controversial. I actually agree with her in what she says. So she says that it's hard not to pity. It's hard to not pity Ghislaine Maxwell. And the reason that she cited was that she has spent 500 days in solitary confinement. And I think it's important for us to remember that, for one, Ghislaine Maxwell, as guilty as many of us might think she is, she has not been convicted yet of a crime. She is innocent until proven guilty in this country, and we have to try our best to keep that perspective. And secondly, I personally think solitary confinement is inhumane for anyone, even if she is convicted.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
I do think there needs to be some shining a light on why is she in solitary confinement when she's not, I mean, she's in jail. She's not at risk to anyone at this point. I mean, I don't know what risk. I mean, maybe it's they consider her own safety, but it just feels like there should be maybe they could put her with inmates who are not as
They should
risky.
be able to keep people safe in prisons and jails without locking them in.
No, I think that's a good point. Yes, I agree with both of you. And I think, like, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, has declared, mostly in the context of Julian Assange, although this is obviously a universal principle, but in that context, he's reminded us that solitary confinement is torture. It's considered torture by the UN. And I think that's a really important point to make, which is that we can both simultaneously critique the media's incestuous relationship with Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein and the literal Prime Minister of England. We can do that without, at the same time, kind of cheering on inhumane treatment of prisoners. And I think that's a really important thing to do. So those are kind of two discussions that we have to have at the same time. And it doesn't mean that we kind of pretend that solitary confinement is something. I mean, I, as a leftist, right, I'm committed to both critiquing the power players' incestuous relationship, the enabling of sexual abuse, sexual assault. Ghislaine Maxwell, of course, is accused of not just facilitating the sexual assault, but participating in it herself. And also, at the same time, I firmly oppose solitary confinement. And I think that is something that sometimes the left and abolitionists, we struggle with, because we are critics of the carceral state, and we have to remain critics of the carceral state, even when the people in the incarcerated are people who we find odious, and even when those people have been treated with the utmost privilege before that point.
Right, and the role of the government here is important, because it's one thing to wish ill on somebody that you consider to be evil. It's one thing to want vengeance, but it's another thing to use the state to enact that vengeance, because A, that's just wrong, and B, it's most often going to be enacted against people that you're much more sympathetic to. So,
right, exactly.
Even if you enjoy
really
this one moment of misery from this world historical villain, it's going to blow back on you, 1,000 or 2 million fold.
Right, right. And we should be focusing on the jail treatment that she got. Right. I mean, we can focus on both things. We can condemn the solitary confinement and the treatment of prisoners, while also acknowledging that she had the opposite up until the point where she finally did get into trouble, right? She was treated like royalty, as we see, and she and Epstein were allowed to abuse people with total impunity. So that's also something we should focus on. And I mean, this woman, Rachel, it shows. I mean, they remind me of the British royalty. Like, maybe there's something wrong with them. Maybe there's some inbreeding. Like, how do you not have the awareness to think of the fact that you don't want to highlight that this glamazon was like rubbing shoulders and legs and thighs with the Prime Minister? Like, don't you have the decency to just hide that, not put that in? Do you think Boris is like, what have you done, Rachel? We tried to keep that a secret. Like,
maybe she doesn't like her brother. Maybe they have a family feud going on.
Yeah, maybe she is throwing him under the bus here. Yeah, and she highlights her podcast. She clearly wants people to listen to her podcast from this week, which she mentioned. She interviews, it sounds like, some reactionary priest. Sorry, I don't know how churches work that well. Lionel Shriver of this parish. I don't know what position he is, but she had him on the show this week on her podcast, and she says he stars on my Difficult Women podcast this week. After discussion with my producer and the execs, we decided not to issue any trigger warnings before dropping the podcast that contains our firmly uncompromising views on immigration, cancel culture, trans issues, cultural appropriation, and having children. She is strongly against, as you know, what you're going to get. You must listen and judge for yourself. So, sorry, I got a little cockney at the end.
You're going to get some real forbidden truths in this podcast.
Yeah, but I think maybe she thinks that sexually assaulting young women is just transgressive, the way that saying things about trans people is, which apparently she thinks that's really...
well, I do think the transgressive nature of it is part of the appeal for these completely unaccountable elites.
Yeah, right. But maybe they should get that, like, sexually assaulting someone isn't a hot take. You're not a victim. Maybe she thinks that Ghislaine Maxwell is a victim of cancel culture. Yeah.
It's gone too far.
Now you've lost me now, obviously. It's cancel culture.
Ghislaine Maxwell, only the Spectator and the Daily Mail. And there's a photo you guys can put in later of the editor of the Daily Mail, very cozy with Ghislaine Maxwell. And, of course, Ghislaine Maxwell's father was incredibly powerful man, Robert Maxwell, who died under very suspicious circumstances.
We just have to find out if Ghislaine Maxwell tweeted something vaguely offensive 20 years ago, and then we can really hold her accountable. Katie Halper, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Katie.
We'll be back with more Rising in just a minute.